Hello and welcome back. Now that you're here, we can get back to discussing the latest Jujutsu Kaisen chapters. As the end of the series draws near, we get a very information-dense chapter, so get ready for a wordy recap, and then we'll jump into thoughts and theories for the final two chapters. So, without further delay, let's begin. The chapter begins with Mei entering a candy store, seemingly before the culling games began, and speaking with an incredibly old person. Mei asked the old person how much they would be willing to pay her, but before we get any more context, we cut away. We then snap back to our protagonists in the modern day, where Maki is yelling at Yuta, who is now back in his original body. Granted, still seemingly using Kenjaku's technique due to his forehead stitches. Maki briefly acknowledges Megumi and asks how he's feeling, to which Megumi claims that he is experiencing some kind of dull brain fog, possibly from tanking so many infinite voids. Megumi declares that he wants to apologize to everyone, and Maki immediately shuts it down, stating confidently that Megumi has nothing to apologize for, as he isn't to blame for Sukuna's actions. Yuji then joins in the conversation to say he has things he would like to apologize for as well, prompting Kusakabe to join in and claim that everything was Gojo's fault for skipping Yuji's execution anyways, and that Yuji was just a victim of Kenjaku's terrorism. He goes on to clarify that he was firmly in favor of Yuji's execution, and that he's only helping them due to Yaga's will. He proceeds to state that he doesn't believe either side was in the wrong due to their own perspectives, and that those perspectives led to the current day, and only the adults should feel shame for the way things have played out. Next, Yuji asks the main question on everyone's minds: how did Yuta survive and get back to his body? Yuta answers by saying that Rika decided to stay with his original body to preserve it using reverse curse technique instead of moving with him to Gojo's body and fighting Sukuna. And because Shoko was able to patch up his original body while Rika kept it fresh the entire time, it was still a viable body for him to return to. Yuta mentions how worried he was that he had died once Kenjaku's technique burnt out in the domain clash, but Mei says that they had miscalculated, instead assuming that Kenjaku had managed to use multiple curse techniques and separate them using barrier techniques, essentially meaning that he was able to compartmentalize his own technique when using domain so that it was unaffected, essentially confirming that the womb profusion domain he used against Yuki was either Geto or Kaori's domains and not his own technique. Mei says that it's obvious Kenjaku would be able to use his technique more effectively due to his extensive experience advantage over Yuta, who had just gotten the technique and had no guidance or explanation to use it. Yuta concludes the explanation by saying that he was left in suspended animation similar to Megumi when he summoned Maharaga, and once he was reconnected to Rika, he was eventually able to get back to his original body, and that he is really sorry for worrying everyone, which prompts Yuji to tell him not to worry about it. Maki then calls out Yuta for conducting himself improperly and failing to execute their plans optimally, saying that she should have been the one to attack Kenjaku, and that Higuruma should have had Inumaki's tape recorder to kill Sukuna with the death penalty while he's unable to move. The narrator explains that while a recording of Toge's voice remains unplayed, the technique is considered in use, so he was unable to activate his technique until the tape recorder was played, and only one tape recorder could be used at a time. Todo then explains that Maki cannot be a target of Boogie Woogie, and that the assassination attempt would have been incredibly risky without the use of his technique, and he calls back to Yuta's original reasoning, claiming that only Rika and Yuta had the power to effectively deal with the rampaging curses released when Kenjaku died. Panda also comes to Yuta's defense, claiming that Toge's technique only worked due to the timing. If they had tried to stop Sukuna before he was heavily weakened and damaged, it would have definitely killed Toge using Backlash, which Toge confirms himself. This sparks Higuruma's theory that Sukuna was just toying with him, and that Yuta's presence would have caused Sukuna to instantly kill Higuruma. He also reminds everyone that cursed speech is easy to counter, and that he was the one to suggest using it in Yuta's domain, because no violence was allowed in his anyways. Kusakabe claims that it's incredibly impressive for Higuruma to still be alive after all that, due to him just having become a sorcerer, and Higuruma responds that it was basically just luck. Maki, feeling defeated, then switches her complaints towards Miguel and Laure, coming in late. but they would only show up after Sukuna was incapable of using domain expansion, so it's a moot point to begin with. Yuji once again comes to Yuta's defense, talking about how helpful Yuta's curse tools were at concealing his fingers, and how helpful his second domain was at weakening Sukuna. Hakari follows Yuji's lead and explains that they were hiding inside of Rika during Gojo's fight with Sukuna, and that it was thanks to Yuta that they were able to isolate Uraume and respond immediately to Gojo's death. Todo voices his regrets about not being able to save Choso and Yuji due to their energy being drowned out by Sukuna's, and Ino also regrets not saving Choso, but if he had, then Yuji would have died to Fuga. Maki gets slightly flustered, saying that she doesn't mean to blame Yuta. Miwa was scared, but glad that she was able to bring Maki with her when Todo used Boogie Woogie on her in Sukuna's domain. Kusakabe was upset that Miwa was in the range, but Miwa had to help out even if she couldn't fight herself. Momo also regrets not being any help to the fighters, but Mei consoles her for giving her a ride on the broom. Hakari says that he planned on taking Sukuna on once he was done with Uraume, but they turned out to be far too powerful, and Nobara says she was asleep, so she doesn't really have anything to do with this. Ui gives himself the title of MVP, which is impossible to dispute, but Kirara gets upset at him for leaving her behind. Ui calls Kirara heavy, and Hakari has to hold her back as Kusakabe remarks how useless Mei was. Ui reminds him that she was busy dealing with the head of the new Shadow-style school. Kusakabe explains that everyone that joins the new Shadow-style school has to undergo very restrictive and unreasonable binding vows that curse the target and sap their life force and force them to follow the rules of the Elder, thus establishing a monopoly that was very strong due to how heavily sorcerers who don't have curse techniques have to rely on new Shadow-style, and how useful Simple Domain is. Mei explains that she learned who the head was from Tengen and was able to kill them, allowing for Kusakabe to become the head and revoke the restrictions, thus freeing the technique for characters like Yuji and Choso to use. We then cut back to the candy store from the beginning of the chapter, where Mei asks how much the Elder is willing to pay for their life. Mei reveals the Elder's plan to gather disciples until their power equaled the big three families, allowing them to take over the entire Jujutsu world. The Elders damn Tengen for exposing them, as Mei explains that without their monopoly on Simple Domain, there would have been far less casualties, and the bindings of New Shadow-style affecting her brother made the Elder's death inevitable, as she doesn't want to have her property become damaged goods. The chapter ends with crows swarming the building as Mei takes candy from the store and leaves the Elder dead in a pile of blood. I do find a lot of value in this chapter. There were a lot of valuable explanations and information that helped fill in a lot of the blanks from the mysterious writing style that Gege used to handle the Shinjuku arc. However, I find myself wondering why we needed to spend almost the entire chapter going over hypotheticals and details of the past that has basically no bearing on the present or future of the plot. We learn that Megumi is vaguely affected by the Unlimited Void. That either means that Sukuna tanked far more of the domain than we thought, or Megumi has the mental strength of a god, when you consider that even 1 second of domain exposure can hospitalize regular people for months, and Megumi had to deal with several minutes of it. We get a relatively satisfying explanation for Yuta's survival, but I am personally dissatisfied with Higuruma's surviving, as Kamutoke never returned to Sukuna, and it was stated that Higuruma's sword was strengthened upon his death. Not to mention that Sukuna personally declared him dead, and was even lost in thought due to it, which I believe undercuts Sukuna's perception, and one of the very few moments that we get to see his perspective and mindset. Maki's constant complaining was mostly fine, because it served as a self-insert for the audience to give Gege a chance to dispute many of the arguments that would be used against his character's decisions. But I don't think that they gave a good reason why Yuta couldn't have recorded himself saying "don't move" and given the tape to Higuruma to avoid the backlash killing Toge and successfully beating Sukuna with the sword. The new Shadow-style plotline was mostly uninteresting in my opinion, and it answered why everyone was able to learn and use the new Shadow-style, but that could have been easily explained by Todo or Gojo teaching everyone during the month of swap training, so I feel that this wasn't an efficient use of a chapter, especially when we are so close to the ending. This chapter also fails to acknowledge the culling game or any specifics of the current situation. It's still unknown if everything dissolved or if the games are still going. We aren't even sure if Tengen is dead, or freed from the control of Kenjaku's technique. So as much as I enjoy this chapter's content and concept, the context and execution just felt very unnecessary except for Yuta's situation, which only took up a very small amount of this chapter. So I'll have to give this chapter a 6 out of 10 for failing to actually progress the plot past establishing Yuta's survival. But the majority of this chapter's issue is just that this information would have been much more important and interesting earlier in the story. In conclusion, it was a decent chapter that really got painted in a negative light due to its spot as the third last chapter ever. And it felt like it was filler to get explanations and hypotheticals out of the way after the main plot thread was concluded in the first couple pages, but it did have some good world building and character interactions. Thanks for watching. We only have 2 more weeks of JJK, so I'd like to invite you all to share your favorite moments from the manga in the comments so that we can all enjoy it while it lasts. But either way, I hope you stay safe and take it easy.